I just wanted to share something I saw today. Abby Martin was on Status Quo. Status Quo is an independent journalist site, and she was talking about the issue of how Israel is losing the propaganda war. And I think that it may be losing the propaganda war because there's just too much ugliness out there now, too many war crimes in plain sight. I mean, bombing a building with AP and other journalist outlets, Al Jazeera, etc., just in broad daylight, bombing the whole building, giving the people a few minutes to get their stuff out, which is impossible, and then bombing it, which is basically trying to censor anything that comes out of Gaza. So that's just another example among many, many, many over the decades of Israel desperately trying to control the narrative so that people continue to believe that it's some sort of equal conflict between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. And they're no longer being able to keep that going because of all the various things that are out there, including just murdering like 50 plus children now. And in 2014, they murdered 500 children, and they kept just bombing and bombing and bombing the open air prison that is Gaza. And you can't keep doing that kind of thing without the general public, despite all the corporate media propaganda propping up Israel, and also the US government propping up Israel and other Western governments propping up Israel, because Israel does their proxy wars for them, helps the US imperialism going, helps keep it going, and in return the Western governments just turn away from the crimes against humanity that Israel is doing. And let's not forget that Human Rights Watch has put out a report, The Threshold Crossed, and B'Tselem, which is a major human rights, well-respected group within Israel, has put out a report about Israel being an apartheid state. There is too much now out there, I think. And people are basically sharing now information that before they would think about, they'd rather be silent. Now they're actually sharing information about this with other people. So I think they've lost the narrative, and Israel has lost the propaganda war, I think, or is losing it, and they're desperate to hang on to it. That's why they've decided to try and make criticizing the apartheid state of Israel, they want to call it anti-Semitic, which is a nonsense. Criticizing apartheid is not, criticizing the crimes of a government is not anti-Semitic. Anyway, so please check out this piece with Abby Martin and Jen Dies from Status Quo, where she talks about how she feels optimistic.
No, I think it is. I mean, I absolutely think it's different because I can feel it in my heart and my soul, and I see it with my own eyes. I think that we all do. I think that Israel had a really strong lockdown on the narrative for quite a while. I mean, you know, we can look at just what Zionism is in general, and it's really a religious supremacist state that's based on the artificial majority of Jewish residents, which means that you need to continue the colonization, ethnic cleansing, and violent expulsion of the indigenous community. And that's been going on for 73 years. Today is actually the anniversary of the Nakba, which is the initial ethnic cleansing, the 800,000 that were purged to, you know, basically eradicated from that area. 75% of people who live in Gaza are refugees, ethnically cleansed from their ancestral lands that are essentially right outside of this artificial border that's been imposed in them. I do think this is different because for decades, Israel's been able to maintain the agenda and deflect all criticism. They basically weaponized this notion that if you criticize a foreign government for committing war crimes, massacres, and atrocities, you're the racist, you're the bigot, right? And that's fascinating that has been able to work and has kind of multiplied out and proliferated to the point where people are just absolutely terrified to criticize Israel because it's become not only synonymous with Judaism, which is just so offensive if you are Jewish. Obviously all these anti-Zionist Jewish organizations worldwide that are condemning this and saying we are not associated with Zionism. This does not mean that you have to be a Zionist to be Jewish. But not only that, it's that the deflection of like what they do to Palestinians, they've somehow deflected it to what Palestinians are doing to them and created this kind of notion that they are the victim, right? They are the perpetual victim and they have the eternal right to self-defense. And I think American citizens in general have been kind of the last ones to wake up. Well, we're the last ones to wake up to a lot of stuff, right? The fact that our own government is committing a lot of genocide and backing a lot of genocide and atrocities around the world. But we grow up in this country thinking that like the US thinking that Israel is essentially just an extension of the US, which is really fascinating to me because I don't, it's so just abhorrent, right? And what it's doing is just so wrong on every level. But for some reason, we are taught, and it's kind of hammered into our heads, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. I don't know how you can call democracy a country that actually subjugates and denies basic democratic rights to 5 million residents, but that it's in danger, that it's constantly threatened by its neighbors, that if they somehow let Palestinians have rights, they would be killed en masse. When meanwhile, it's all this hypothetical scenario to essentially continue this open colonization project and this colonial settler colonial apartheid state. And for the longest time that worked. And I think that with the advent of social media, probably in the last 10 years, and I would say specifically with the 2014 war, things really started to shift because Palestinians were finally able to film themselves. It was no longer Israel putting out cartoons and doctored, photoshopped graphics and, IDF spokespeople all the time with American accents because they speak English directed toward American audiences all over corporate media. But the rise of YouTube and all of these outlets, and then, of course, Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff, people are finally being able to generate content that accurately depicts reality. And when you're getting bombed, if you're a Palestinian, you are living in this rubble and you are experiencing these daily horrors, you film it. They have cell phones, they're posting this material. And so 2014, the horrific bloodletting that, we saw 2,200 Palestinians die, 500 kids in a 3-week period. That was, I think, a breaking point for a lot of people. They were absolutely shocked at what Israel was doing. And then, you had a couple of years later, the Great March of Return, which was another big breaking moment for people. You saw people like Natalie Portman actually coming out and rejecting awards that she was being given from the Israeli government. You saw a lot of musicians actually canceling their tours in Israel. You saw a lot of political pressure be mounted and a lot of academic and cultural pressure from the outside, from just important figures that were saying, I'm not going to go and speak in Israel because I don't share these values and stuff like that. And a lot of huge advocates for Israel actually flipped the script, like people like Seth Rogen, who in 2014 was saying this is Hamas's fault that 500 kids died. And then fast forward to today, he's saying, no, I don't stand with what Israel's doing. So now, after the Great March of Return, after the 2014 massacre, all of a sudden, I think that the sentiment and consciousness has been bubbling since those moments. And this is another huge moment where the consciousness is on fire. It's spreading in the most rapid way that I've ever seen. And Israel is so desperate. And they knew that this was coming. This is why they have kind of been proactive in criminalizing BDS activism, right? They've passed 30 or so laws across the United States to criminalize peaceful boycotts and constitutionally protected free speech. But this shift has been boiling under the surface for years and years and years, and we have not really seen it until now. And they did this knowing that they would be challenged in a big way soon, and they are scared this sentiment is going to develop into a real political movement that is going to defund them ultimately. And that's a beautiful thing, because I don't think that we can put the genie back in the bottle at this point. I think that you cannot call yourself a progressive if you are not for the liberation of Palestine.
Right.
And that's just not a tenable position. So as much as you have the liberal political establishment and corporate media running cover for this, I think that in political organizing spaces and anti-war mobilizations, this is an issue as clear as day at this point, and there's no going back. And that's why you see people like Benny Gantz, who's an Israeli cabinet official, going straight to Facebook and TikTok, urging them to censor Palestinian organizations and Palestinian journalists, and also, quote unquote, disinformation. So they're going to these outlets, telling them to censor, and they're doing it. TikTok actually removed one huge Palestinian organization's account, because this is all under the banner of fake news, right? Because they know how dangerous and damaging this is to their narrative. They don't want this stuff to get out there, and they know people are turning away from corporate media. So this is where we're at today, is that you have these social media networks and these tech giants acquiescing to Israel. We already know Facebook has several people working on the board that are actually formerly with the Israeli government or IDF. And, you know, these people are littered across corporate media, but alternative media has become so strong, which is, of course, why they're now purging people's YouTube accounts. They've throttled Status Quo. They've throttled the movie that we put out. They know how dangerous this kind of counter narrative is. Absolutely.
Sorry,
they banned someone's Twitch account for 30 days for streaming it. I mean, I'll just sum it up by saying the fact that you have organizations like Human Rights Watch that notoriously kind of both sides the issue, actually coming out and saying unequivocally Israel's an apartheid state and there's no turning back. You have the ICC, the International Criminal Court, saying, you know, we're going to pursue war crime charges in the occupied territories. And then you have a Gallup poll that takes Democratic Party voters' opinions on the quote unquote conflict every year. And for the first time ever, more Democratic Party voters actually say that more pressure should be on Israel than Palestine. So even though you have unabashed Zionists like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the rest of the people who are, you know, claim to represent us, not condemning Israel and always beginning every statement with Israel has the right to defend itself against rockets without any context of what preceded the rockets, this is not going to be a tenable position anymore. And I think the pressure is just going to continue to mount as people continue to link all of these struggles together and understand how it all originates from the U.S. empire, from U.S. militarism, and that we are essentially subsidizing this terrorism and apartheid to the tune of $10 million every day. And it really has to start here, Jen.